The Russian state-owned railway company RZD, which the Kremlin's propaganda machine has been marketing for years as too big to fail, is no longer a viable company. It is a colossal financial black hole collapsing under an unimaginable debt of 3.36 trillion rubles. This figure is difficult to even pronounce. It is the accounting record of an empire's ruins, exceeding the gross domestic product of some small nations. But behind the cold face of the numbers lies a much more terrifying, much more human tragedy. More than 700,000 loyal employees and their families, meaning millions of people indirectly, find themselves overnight in the icy embrace of unemployment, absolute uncertainty, and ruthless misery. Vladimir Putin's senseless war in the fertile lands of Ukraine has now boomeranged back and is ruthlessly destroying his own country's largest company and largest employer. Now Russia's largest employer is putting 700,000 workers on unpaid leave. This is not a simple declaration of bankruptcy. It is the beginning of an uncontrollable social apocalypse, an era of panic and chaos. Because in this vast continent, stretching across 11 time zones, from Kaliningrad in Europe to Vladivostok in the Pacific, where roads are frozen shells for most of the year, or an impassable sea of mud known as Razbutita, RZD is not just a transportation option. It is the sole and indispensable life support unit enabling the country to sustain its economic, military, and industrial existence. The steel network you see on the screen is Russia's circulatory system. The political and industrial capitals of the West, Moscow and St. Petersburg, can only beat with the blood pumped by RZD. These two metropolises function as land ports. They receive technology and components from the West, or from what was once the West, process them, and distribute them throughout the country via the steel arteries of the RZD. These arteries feed the regime's economic engine. They connect the massive metallurgical plants in the Urals, the bottomless oil and gas fields of Siberia, and strategic ocean outlets like Murmansk in the Arctic or Vladivostok on the Pacific to the center. Not only people travel on those rails. T-90 tanks heading to the front, wheat wagons bound for Asian markets, millions of tons of coal keeping thermal power plants running in winter, and raw steel feeding tank factories are also transported. When this network stops, not only do 700,000 people lose their jobs, Russia's entire industrial metabolism, its entire war machine, is completely paralyzed. This is not just the collapse of Russia's largest company, but the logistical strangulation of a continent. To grasp why the collapse of RZD is far beyond an ordinary corporate failure, equating to the collapse of a civilization, it is essential to understand its place in Russia's social and psychological geography. RZD was never an ordinary company run by a Western CEO and existing through profit and loss statements. It was a structure inherited from the ashes of the Soviet Union, operating with its own laws, its own hierarchy, and its own social fabric, almost like a state within a state. With over 700,000 registered employees, it is not only statistically Russia's largest employer, but also the country's most extensive, deepest-rooted, and most complex social security network. It was a kind of modern-day feudalism, a refuge for millions of people whom the state could not reach, neglected, or forgot. RZD's own official sustainability reports and corporate publications reveal how deeply this structure was ingrained. This massive structure provided its employees and their families in every settlement along the railway line not just a monthly salary, but a full standard of living from birth to death. Across the 11 time zones stretching from Moscow to Vladivostok, every RZD employee and their family had virtually unlimited free travel rights within the country. This meant families could visit relatives thousands of kilometers away and see different corners of the country. Even in the most remote villages hard to find on a map, where state hospitals had fallen into ruin, RZD had modern, well-equipped clinics and polyclinics. This meant that millions of people had access to healthcare services at Western standards. For young, newly married railway worker families, housing assistance offered at rates far below market interest rates with almost symbolic installments turned the dream of homeownership into reality. RZD was much more than just a workplace for millions of people. It was a guarantee, an identity, a refuge in a cold and cruel world. This system was the most concrete, tangible example of the implicit promise of stability that Putin offered the Russian people. We are talking about real security that people experienced every day, not abstract successes on propaganda television. But now the iron gates of this lost paradise are slamming shut with a bang, never to open again, swept away by the ruthless financial storm created by the war. This collapse, therefore, is not simply the loss of jobs. For millions of people, it is the end of an entire way of life, all social security, a generation's accumulation, and the last shreds of hope for the future. Those people are losing not only their paychecks, but the schools their children will attend, the hospitals their elderly parents will be treated, and most importantly, their last belief that the state will take care of them after all their sacrifices. This structure, once the unshakable backbone of the country, has now become a steel guillotine that has wrapped itself around the neck of the regime under its own weight. So, how did this massive, supposedly unsinkable industrial titan end up crushed under its own weight, facing this painful end? The roots of this collapse run deep, but the fuse that triggered the explosion was lit in one place: the Kremlin's decision to attack Ukraine. Reports leaked from Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service and made public worldwide through independent platforms like RBC Ukraine clearly exposed the main culprit behind this collapse: Vladimir Putin's relentless obsession with war. The bloody toll of the war was reflected mercilessly and inevitably in every RZD track, every wagon, every engineer, and every ticket clerk. This destruction was a multi-layered process. The first blow came in the form of international sanctions. When Russia's traditional trade routes with Europe and Asia were severed overnight, RZD's most profitable operations, international freight transport, were cut off like a knife. Containers piled up in ports and wagons accumulated at borders. According to the company's official data, freight volumes plummeted by 7.3% in just 1 year. This was not just a statistical decline. It meant billions of dollars that should have gone into the company's coffers had vanished into thin air. This massive financial bloodletting inevitably translated into human costs. Initially, tens of thousands of experienced workers were laid off under the guise of mandatory unpaid leave, effectively dismissed without any compensation to conceal the Kremlin's embarrassment. This was only the beginning. However, the war was merely an accelerant for this tragic story. The real disease lay within the system itself. In reality, the war was merely the final and fatal blow to a system that had already been rotting from within for years due to endemic corruption, unimaginable inefficiency, and a chronic culture of mismanagement. Academic studies such as the report titled The Privatization of Russia, published by the Wilson Center, which describes kleptocracy in Russia, detail how Putin's private monopoly system turned the state into a source of income for a handful of loyal oligarchs and bureaucrats. RZD was at the very center of this corrupt system, with its multi-billion-dollar infrastructure tenders, opaque subcontracting agreements, and unaccountable expenditures. Even in peacetime, this cumbersome, inefficient, and rotten structure, barely surviving on massive state subsidies and constantly rising ticket prices, completely collapsed under the combined factors of the costs of war, international sanctions, the logistical pressure created by military shipments, and the severing of dependence on Western technology. This is not just the collapse of Russia's largest company, but the logistical strangulation of a continent.
It is the collapse of an economic model. Putin's 25-year legacy of power, and the strong state propaganda. The demise of RZD will not be an isolated event that begins and ends in the corridors of a headquarters building in Moscow. Its collapse will spread like cancer across Russia's vast and unforgiving geography, creating a total domino effect that will drag hundreds of towns into darkness and oblivion along with it. At the heart of this impending disaster are the monogorods, the most fragile points in Russia's social and economic structure. This term, single industry towns, refers to settlements whose entire economic, social, and cultural existence is tied like a root to a single large industrial facility or company. For hundreds of towns stretching from the freezing taigas of Siberia to the industrial basins of the Ural Mountains, from the edge of the Arctic Circle to the shores of Lake Bal, RZD is not only the largest employer in the region, but literally life itself. In these monogorod towns, the town's main street leads to the station. The town's largest and most solid building is the RZD regional office. The town's school was built for the children of railway workers. The town's only hospital or clinic belongs to RZD's health department. When RZD's operations stop, life in these towns will also stop. This is not a metaphor, but a bitter reality. When the massive wagon workshops where trains are maintained are locked down, when hundreds of staff who sell tickets at stations, change switches, and manage signaling are laid off, the economic lifeline that feeds these towns and gives them life will be completely severed. From this point on, the collapse will snowball. Schools will gradually close because young families left unemployed will be forced to migrate to big cities or other regions to survive. This is not just an economic crisis, but also a deep demographic catastrophe that will take generations to repair. The war launched by Vladimir Putin for his imperial ambitions is now creating a vast belt of ghost towns spread across millions of square meters in the heart of his own country. These abandoned towns, their windows boarded up, will go down in history as silent, cold, and unforgettable monuments to the regime's betrayal and failure of its own people. The most chilling and concrete evidence of how deeply the Kremlin fears this impending and seemingly uncontrollable social catastrophe comes from an internal memo obtained by Ukrainian intelligence services and leaked to the public. According to this report, confirmed by sources, the RZD management, on the verge of bankruptcy and mass layoffs, launched a large-scale process to equip more than 30,000 personnel from its own corporate security units with fully armed firearms following a direct order from the Kremlin. Let's pause for a moment and consider the absurdity and gravity of this situation. Why would a technically bankrupt, debt-ridden civilian railway company arm tens of thousands of its employees like an army? This is not a measure taken against attacks or an external military threat. If that were the case, this task would belong to the Army or the Internal Intelligence Service, the FSB. This is the starkest confession of a deep, paranoid, and primitive fear of a massive explosion coming from within, from its own people, from its own loyal employees. A strategic analysis of this move reveals the radical and dangerous transformation in the regime's view of its own people. This means that the Kremlin now knows very well that this massive social tsunami will not be limited to peaceful protests, that millions of people who have lost their jobs, homes, futures, and dignity will not silently accept their fate. They are terrified of the potential for mass strikes, railway blockades, sabotage, and ultimately full-scale rebellion by 700,000 angry, disillusioned, organized people who have nothing left to lose. This is not a simple security measure. It is preparation for a potential civil war, a crackdown operation against its own people. These tens of thousands of armed security personnel are being transformed into a private army, a company militia, to be used tomorrow to disperse angry crowds occupying the tracks, to crush strikes with bloodshed, and to re-establish the regime's shaken control with an iron hand. This is the clearest and bloodiest proof that the regime no longer sees its own citizens as a people, but as a potential enemy, a threat that must be kept under control. This is the moment when a state completely loses its trust in its own people, and there is usually no turning back from this point. This dramatic series of events is far beyond a tactical economic crisis or the managerial failure of a large company. It is an irreversible strategic rupture that dynamites the existential foundations and ideological cement of the regime built by Vladimir Putin. As detailed in recently published analyses, Putin's nearly quarter-century rule was based on an unwritten, tacit social contract with the Russian people. The terms of this informal agreement were as simple as they were ruthless, known to every Russian citizen. You completely renounce your political freedoms, your right to competitive elections, independent media, freedom of expression, and democratic participation mechanisms. In return, I will promise you the most basic thing you sought after the chaos of the 90s: economic stability, a predictable future, and the basic security provided by the state. Millions of Russians silently accepted this pragmatic bargain. They consciously distanced themselves from politics, turned a blind eye to the Kremlin's increasing authoritarianism,
and enjoyed the limited but real prosperity and order offered to them. Salaries were paid on time, there was pension security, and the state provided at least a protective shield for its own citizens. However, by turning the country's largest and most symbolic employer, the livelihood of millions of families, into a pile of rubble created by war, and by throwing 700,000 loyal, apolitical employees out onto the street and into uncertainty overnight, Vladimir Putin has cold-bloodedly and unilaterally torn up this sacred contract in front of millions of people. As a result, the total collapse of Russian railways is not an isolated crisis story in the economic pages or a simple tale of corporate failure. It is the most concrete manifestation of a much larger, much darker reality. The clearest and most painful proof that Vladimir Putin's insatiable war machine, in order to survive, is no longer content with enemy territory, but is now devouring the industrial heart, the social fabric, and the most loyal citizens of his own country, ruthlessly consuming itself. Across every corner, every station, every town of this vast and wounded geography, spanning 11 time zones, a massive social bomb with 700,000 fuses has been silently planted. Each fuse of this bomb, ready to explode, is a railway worker who has lost his job, a young person whose future has been stolen, an abandoned Monogorod, and a family that has lost its last faith in the state. The social ground beneath the regime has shifted irreversibly, never to return to its former state. The Kremlin may believe that by arming tens of thousands of security personnel, it can control and suppress this inevitable explosion with an iron hand and fear. However, history has shown us repeatedly and painfully that no weapon, no army can stand against a popular uprising fueled by hunger, anger, broken dignity, and despair. The ticking of this time bomb can now be heard, not only from Moscow, but even from the remotest corners of Siberia. And its explosion is no longer a question of if, but only a matter of when. So, what do you think about this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.